Okay, so I think we will be starting. I will be chairing this session. So we start with Jaroslav Svelch. Yeah, you need the image. I think Niklas knows which button to push. Which HDMI? Number one. Oh, okay. I think Jaro needs no introduction. He's the famous author of the famous book about gaming, The Iron Curtain, that you definitely should read if you haven't already. It's an excellent read. Oh, is it here? Yes, it has a fantastic cover. Some really cool stuff here. Maybe I can pass it around so people can touch it and engage with it. And Jaro works at Charles University in Prague. And if you want to tell anything else about yourself, please do. Let's. Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah, so let's continue.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jaroslav. I'm happy to be here. And I'll be talking about my experience doing interviews and using interviews in game history in my project about game history in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. It's called Tall Tales and Murky Memories of Computer Gaming in 1980s Czechoslovakia. And before I proceed, I just want to say one thing about this image. It's not really related to interviews, but some of you might be interested. In about a month, there's going to be the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And to commemorate that anniversary, there's going to be a lot of exhibitions. And for one of those exhibitions, a team, including myself and a friend of mine, put together 3 conversions of activist games from the late 80s. And we also commissioned new pixel art for those conversions. So this is not original pixel art, this is newly commissioned pixel art for those conversions. So if you're interested in this project, you can also ask any questions, or probably we can discuss it in the next session. I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a very cool project. But I'll be mostly talking about games. This is based on the experience that I had while working on this book. It was a long process. It took about 10 years to do the research and write the book. I was doing other stuff as well, but it was just a long project. And the book is available from MIT Press, and I also have leaflets with discounts if you want to take one later and order the book. So I was working to write this history, which is a user-centered history. It's mostly about homebrewers and amateurs. I used a wide range of sources. Interviews that I'll be talking about, I did over 40 interviews, all of them in person, with this actual voice recorder. Period documents, there were no magazines at that time, no computer magazines, so I was mostly relying on newsletters of computer clubs. There were computer clubs that were putting out their own kind of periodicals. So I was looking at that. I was collecting, not really collecting, I was looking at material artifacts. I usually borrow them from people and took pictures and then return them, because right now there's no memory institution in the country that collects artifacts related to gaming, unfortunately. But there are artifacts in people's homes and in personal collections, definitely. And I was looking at software, so I was looking at the games that had been preserved from the 1980s, thanks to the efforts of fan archivists. They have done invaluable work. I'm very thankful to them. This talk will not be about them, but they also need to be mentioned. And before I talk about interviews, I'm also, when writing a history of a relatively broad topic as computer gaming in a particular country, in a particular decade, I was mostly focusing on user experience, or experience of individual users, but there also needs to be some background, about the policy and the proliferation of technology and so on. So I was also trying to look for records and statistics, but unfortunately from the 80s, what we have is very limited. Because the kind of homebrew scene was not really captured in any official records. So what we have is mostly records about sort of official side of computing. So here is a really nice statistic of the numbers of women in official computing companies, so like state-owned computing. But we don't really have that data about the homebrew scene. So yeah, we have to rely on sources that are have not been officially vetted and are were at that time made by homebrewers themselves. So I said that I talked to over 40 people. It was a diverse and open group of informants. And what do I mean by diverse and open? Diverse, well, in terms of, most of them were white guys, so not really diverse in this, and from this particular perspective. There were some women as well, but diverse in terms of their story. So all of them were somehow active on the scene in the 1980s, making games or being in charge of computer clubs. But since then, they have very different stories. So some of them are now, millionaire owners of finance companies, or one of them, like Vlastimil Vesely, is still in the same job that he had in the 80s, so he's a technician in a public transport company in the city of Ostrava. Politically, they're all over the spectrum. Some of them are anarchists, some of them are libertarian, and one of them is even like very far right, so it's also diverse in this regard. And by open, I mean that they talk to me openly, mostly. The things that I ask about are usually not very controversial. And there is a certain benefit to writing about 1980s because it was a different regime. So if somebody did something illegal or subversive or transgressive, they don't really mind sharing that story because it was a different regime and it was an oppressive regime, so any subversion was okay. So in this, I haven't really encountered any obstacles in people not wanting to talk about certain things. But there are certain challenges in using interviews in historical work, and I just want to share my experience. And I'll be sometimes quoting from this textbook of oral history by Donald Ritchie, which I think is very useful. I was using this one, but I was also using a Czech textbook of oral history, which is also very, very, very good. Yeah, like one of the main the rules is that we should treat oral evidence as cautious as any other form of evidence. So it's not necessarily more or less reliable, but it has its specifics that I've grown to be aware of. The first challenge I encountered was that people would often share apocryphal stories, or sometimes tall tales. And Ritchie writes in the book that about the encounters between folklorists and oral historians in the early stages of oral history, of the development of the field, saying that folklorists watched with some amusement as oral historians gradually came to grips with stereotype and myth in the oral testimonies they were collecting. And I will give you an example. So in the 1980s, it was very hard to get a computer in Czechoslovakia. And the story of getting a computer often became a part of the sort of personal history of the fan, of the enthusiast. And to get a computer, usually you had to bring it from abroad. It was not easy. People were smuggling machines from the West to avoid very high customs fees. And you get to hear these stories about a friend of somebody smuggling a Sinclair ZX Spectrum, which became the dominant platform, in a chocolate box. And it's something that you would really struggle to find evidence for. So the story is that in West Germany you could buy these kind of 2-layer chocolate boxes, and people would eat the bottom layer of the chocolates and put the Spectrum into the box and leave the top layer intact, and this way they would smuggle the computer into the country. It's probably technically possible, but there is really no evidence of that. And I think that we don't really have to. That's not really like a huge problem as long as we don't treat it as a fact, but as an indication that it was difficult to smuggle these countries, and that these stories circulated to kind of emphasize the fact that it's hard to get a computer into that country. Sometimes you can get some corroboration for tall tales. I interviewed Tomáš Smutný, who was a person who was smuggling, or his group of friends and collaborators were smuggling arcade boards from Germany, and then they were building these DIY arcade cabinets and the controls and the whole machines beside, except for the board, they were building in Czechoslovakia. And he said that he that they made over 500 of these machines, and then he got arrested for it. I cannot really check if they made 500, but I could check if he got arrested. And I went to the police archives and I found out that indeed he was arrested. He was actually let out before Christmas. So I think that they were kind of lenient on him, and in the end he was released, and he was never tried, but he was actually arrested briefly.
Because of what reason?
For what reason? Illegal enterprise. Yeah. Another challenge is gaps. And so people remember, as Richie says, people remember what they think is important, not necessarily what the interviewer thinks is most consequential. And my approach was to write a social history. So I was very much interested in how these groups, how these user groups were functioning, and what kind of people took part in these activities. But the interviewers usually expect me to ask about the software and the hardware. They expect questions about the Sinclair Spectrum, about particular games, about particular technical solutions, not really about the social aspects of gaming. I think that this is to some extent a reflection of some of the focus of lay games history, which is very much focused on artifacts rather than social history. So they tend to be quite surprised when I ask them questions about the social life of computer fans in the 1980s. And it takes sort of some priming and some trying before they start to remember. But then they very much enjoy it, but they don't really expect that. At least most of the people that I've talked to. Another example, in the 1980s, when people wanted to gather and work on computers together, play games, they usually had to join these computer clubs affiliated with state-controlled organizations like paramilitary organizations like Svazar, or youth organizations like the Socialist Youth Union. Very often they don't remember being members of those organizations. For example, František Fuka, one of the probably the most influential homebrewer in 1980s Czechoslovakia, had said that he was never a member of the Socialist Youth Union before he found actually the member card of the Socialist Youth Union. And in this case, I don't think they're ashamed of being members, but I think it speaks to the very pragmatic relationship they had to these organizations. It was not a meaningful choice to join such an organization. It was sort of automatic, and many, especially younger people, will say that they don't remember which organization they were members of, because they were just too young to care, I guess. And the older interviewees would tell you that they only did it for pragmatic reasons, and they never identified with the goals of those organizations. So here I think that the gaps are meaningful. The fact that people don't remember this attests to the fact that it wasn't really important for them at the time. Also, we don't have that much information about what happened in those clubs in terms of visual evidence, because there's very little photographic evidence from Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, because cameras were expensive. They were also all black and white, and I was lucky that one of my informants actually was an amateur photographer, so we have like beautiful images like these, but there are very few of them. The third challenge that I encountered are what I call planted memories. And Richie says that film and fictional portrayals of historic events can filter into people's memories, confusing images with real events. And I think that's true of all oral history. I'll give one particular example. So there was this famous game called Elite, which was very popular, in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. And in an interview, one informant was telling me that he was an intense player of Elite, and that he really felt like the pilot, and that whenever there was lunch, like he wouldn't care about lunch and he would keep playing. But then I remembered a very influential piece of game writing called The Gamer Ballad. It's like an essay or a short story about a life of a gamer. It was published in Excalibur, which was an extremely influential gaming magazine in the early 90s. And you can read pretty much the same story about people playing Elite and not not having lunch. And I think that my suspicion is that this is not a coincidence, that this is, that people so strongly identified with the gamer ballad as a portrayal of a gamer's life that they might have actually, internalized some of those stories or shaped their own stories based on that piece of writing. So I think it's also important to look at, the written material that was preserved from that era to kind of see how the discourse might have been formed by magazines and so on. Number 4, feedback loop with a researcher. It's kind of similar. That's kind of similar. So I said that the project took about 10 years. That's a long time. And in the process, I was disseminating the research in sort of popular outlets as well as academic ones. So I was writing a series of articles for the gaming magazine called Level, and it's a pretty popular one. They also republished some of the stuff online, so people could read those articles. And what happened to me then is that my informants would quote myself to me, which is not exactly desirable. So they would use my interpretation of the events. Like in this example, the informant says, "It was like you wrote." They're talking about the greetings, the shout-outs that people would put into scrolling messages not only in demos but also in games. I want to say hi to this guy and that guy and Patrick or Tomáš, for example, people who didn't even know each other, greeted each other and maintained the community in this way. And this is more or less a quote from an article that I wrote. So now I'm contaminating sort of my own material, and it's really I think it's important to kind of keep track of that. And the final challenge is deciding who will in the end appear in the story. This is a screenshot from the index of the book, and one thing happened to me. I talked to one of my informants. I gave him the copy of the book, and the first thing he did was that he looked at the index and he didn't find his name in the index. And he was a bit sad because his name is Hlava, so you can see he's not here, but his colleague, his friend Herda Stanislav, is actually there. So he felt a bit betrayed that his name is not there. And I think we have to be ready to explain to people that there are some reasons why they're not included in this particular version of the story. They might be included in some other version of the story. When I started writing the book, people said, "Okay, so you're writing a book about the history of games in Czechoslovakia. So you're writing about František Fuka, right? He was the most influential one. He's the most famous." And I was a bit reluctant, and I tried for a long time to kind of avoid writing about him. But in the end, based on the evidence that I got from others, I found that he was indeed so influential that he needs to be a huge part of the story. I really kind of wanted to see that myself from the material. And the other problem that sometimes happens is that there are potential informants that are just unavailable. So in the late 1980s, people were making activist games or protest games against the communist regime. And this is one of them. It's called 17th of November 1989, and it chronicles the events of the Velvet Revolution. It's a text adventure game. By the way, this image, the face and the hand are taken from The Way of the Exploding Fist. It's like a remix of the loading screen of The Way of the Exploding Fist, the Australian game from 1985. And I have so far not been able to track down Hobblesoft, who made this game, or other people, except for one, that made these protest games, because they were, for obvious reasons, released anonymously in the late 80s. So yeah, these are some of the challenges that I've come across, but that doesn't really diminish the value of oral history or of interviews. And I think it's important not to think of our meetings, our relationships with informants only as a source of material for interviews, but also as opening doors to other people, to other material, giving us new perspectives and kind of new avenues that we can follow. It's not only about that one interview, And also, I think we need to be aware of the fact that this might be a long collaboration. The fact that you show up at somebody's door and you will interview them might start a relationship that will go on for years and years and years. And at one point you will need permissions to use their photographs. You will need permissions to use screenshots from their games. So it is sort of a commitment on both sides, and I think that's something we should keep in mind. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. What a beautiful pixel art it is. Can you mention the name of the author of the pixel art?
It's Jana Kilianova, or also called Yuffie. She's a professional illustrator and computer graphics artist based in Brno, Czech Republic.
Great female pixel artist. So, Jarkko.
Thank you, Jaro. Two questions. One very, but one question and one comment. The comment is that talking about this feedback loop. I think one kind of form of it is also that we, in many cases, we interview the same people, and they are kind of usual suspects. Mm-hmm. And it happens, I would say that they usually talk again and again the same things, and it's very difficult to kind of try to dig something completely new, because they have this kind of ready-made story they start to tell every time somebody is asking about the issue. And one question is about are you going to write an article about this methodological notions about how to use oral history when you're doing this kind of research?
Thank you. So the first one, I absolutely agree. And that is also one of the reasons why I wanted to avoid František Fuka at the beginning, because he's been interviewed many times, and I knew that I would get more or less the same stories. And second question, I haven't really thought about it yet, but if there's an audience, I would love to. There's also some discussion of the methodology in the introduction of the book. Thank you.
Yes, well, please.
Yes, is it on?
No, you should press
Now, okay, yeah, now it's on. Well, thanks a lot for this presentation, Jaro. I mean, it's really important that we have these methodological considerations in what we are researching, and like what you told about the pitfalls and what you have to watch out with oral history interviews. I mean, I experienced quite the same things interviewing old cracking scene members from the 80s. And there is one thing, and I wonder whether, which was an important observation that I had to make when conducting oral history interviews, and I wonder whether it's the same case with your guys. What I noticed is that what people tell and what they put their emphasis on depends very much on whether they stuck with computing when they grew up, or whether they took some completely different paths. And concerning the people that I interviewed, I always found, for a social history of computing, I always found those narratives more detailed and more helpful of those people who did not stick with computing. Because, for example, some of my respondents, they ended up in the games industry and so on, like IT professionals. Some became, I don't know, janitors or tram drivers and so on. And those who did not remain in computing, they do not need to pull their legitimacy for their life course from their computing past. And thus, their narrative is not as streamlined as the one of those who stuck in IT or computing. I wonder whether this is the case as well with your people.
I think to some extent, definitely. Yeah, and also the people who are still in computing are very often active in the retro gaming circles. So they are also used to telling these stories again and again. Yeah, so I think it's very similar. I think that in my case, there were also some people who work professionally in IT. One of my respondents works for Microsoft, and he's one of the few people who still actually writes in machine code. So he writes the OS core. So he's very much an IT professional, but I was talking about anarchists. So he's more like a kind of punk rock, kind of anarchist kind of guy. So I think that it's his job, but I think his ideology is a bit different. So it's not important for him, like personally and ideologically, to identify as this IT kind of guru. So I think that he was more open and more willing to talk about the social aspect. But I think it was more of an exception. So I agree.
Want to add a question in the same direction and wonder if you also have the opportunity in Czechoslovakia,
Yeah, Czechia or Czech Republic, yeah.
No, Czechoslovakia, I think it's over.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But that's exactly the point. So in Germany, when I researched East German gaming culture, I had the great opportunity to access the archives of the Secret Service of the Stasi, because they were opened when the GDR was over, and so they wrote pretty much about these cultures because they were important for them, and so that's of course a great external source from the outside on these activities and people and communities. And I wonder if you have the same opportunity in Czech Republic.
Yeah. The secret police archives are accessible. They are not very well indexed, but they are open. Actually, me and Maria have been thinking about writing some kind of comparative study about like Poland and Czech Republic, based on the secret police archives. But it seems that in Czechoslovakia, the secret police was not as active in kind of following computer games and computing as they were in the GDR. Because I know from articles by Dennis Giesler, who's a journalist, but he writes great articles about games in East Germany, that Stasi was very much interested in computer clubs, and they reported on them, and they have these like amazing reports on what's happening in the clubs. But it doesn't seem, or my archivists have not been able to point me to those materials, or they don't exist. So I'm not, probably not so much.
Yeah. So one addition. There should be a possibility for you to access the East German archives, searching for entries and documents about microcomputer cultures and smuggling towards Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
That should be an option to request that access.
Cool, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
As is the case for many of us, we kind of study ourselves, and this is a personal topic for you. So, how did you manage to step back and question your assumptions and hates and likes in your study?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that one of the ways I did it was that I'm writing about the 80s, but I was born in 1981, so I wasn't really participating in the community in the 1980s. I think I only started continuously engaging with games in the 90s, but I'm still familiar with the hardware, with the Spectrum and all these things, and I can remember very clearly. But I wasn't involved in the community at the time. So I think most of this information that I get is new to me, but I think I'm kind of able to comprehend it and interpret it based on the knowledge of the computing in just slightly after the 1980s. So that's I think that's one way of doing it. I think originally I was going to write about the 90s, but then one of the reasons why I didn't was that it just felt too personal, and it would also be more difficult to talk to people about the 90s because it's the same regime. So if they did something illegal in the 90s, it's kind of more difficult to get information from them. But also because my personal involvement. Yeah, that's one of the ways. And then you just have to try to be impartial.